Welcome back to the museum here in Ukraine. Just to remind you, it's very much a living, breathing museum, even though it's honouring those, many of whom have lost their lives in battle. Joining us now is our next guest, Peter Zalmayev from the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Peter, great to meet you in person.
Pleasure.
We've spoken many times
Indeed.
over this year on France 24, and we've always appreciated your analysis. We're standing among certain things which clearly suggest the type of things that might concern you. I know you're obviously concerned with war crimes, you're concerned with how military issues are used. We have a drone beside us, used for spying, shot down over the Donbass. An interesting paint job done in traditional Ukrainian fashion to kind of, I don't know, make it seem like a more humble and domestic thing. But nonetheless, these kind of things, I mean, you see that sort of shell, when that goes through a house, through a school, what kind of damage are we talking about? What kind of damage does this do?
I mean, this would probably take out an entire room, you know, and this reminds me of the fact that something we overlook, I mean, as the war goes on, just the staggering environmental damage that it has caused Ukraine. Even, you remember, General Chancellor Scholz said a few months ago that just to demine Ukraine will take tens of decades, you know. I mean, the toll is staggering on people, on the environment, on animals, on air, on everything.
In terms of war crimes, what we're looking at here, we've just seen a report from Bucha. What happened there, without going through the whole process, you just have to put two and two together. It is clearly something which is atrocious. And it's happened in repeated places across Ukraine. Do you think you'll ever be able to cope with it, to get it through to justice? Do you think those responsible will be actually brought before any kind of court?
What you just said, it pains me probably the most. The fact that we are increasingly living in completely different informational universes, different informational narratives. The Russian Federation has created a veritably alternative universe inside their country, where whatever happened in Bucha was a fake, it was a theater play, it was staged, and daily I go on various TV channels, including in India, for example, where the anchor will start his question like, when Ukraine decided to attack Russia, and when Ukraine decided to fake the atrocities in Bucha, this is what's literally, like, figuratively speaking, killing me, is that, you know, the entire, I mean, I wouldn't say the entire population, but a sizable part of the Russian population do not even believe that their army is capable of these atrocities. From the very start of this terror campaign against Ukraine, this war, which we start from 2014, and the downing of MH17, you remember, Russia has denied any responsibility for the actions of its army. It has essentially unilaterally abandoned, you know, the system of law and order, international law. It has refused to abide by these standards. Eventually, justice will prevail. The question is how long it will take. We have the precedent of Germans after World War II. It took a sizable part of the German population until the 60s to fully come to terms with what was wrought in their name.
Indeed. Peter, for now, bear with us. Let's bring in our Chief Foreign Editor, Robert Parsons. Rob is in Kramatorsk, where one of the possible worst, I think, atrocities, well, I don't just think, it's something that the international authorities think, one of the worst cases that was committed took place. Rob, I hope you can hear us. Obviously talking about what happened at the railway station back in April.
Yeah, I was in Ukraine at the time, Mark, not this part of the Ukraine. I was right on the far other side in the western Ukraine city of Lviv when the news came through. Actually, we were expecting a train to come through with internally displaced people, and we were at the station in Lviv waiting for that train when the news started to come through that the station in Kramatorsk had been attacked and that so many people had died. And one of the most horrific incidents in this war, and certainly at that time the most horrific incident. Gradually after that, people started to trickle through on trains that came after, and so we started to get the whole story. But it was truly awful.
60 people are killed. I think that's probably a very, very conservative estimate, Rob.
Yeah, I think it probably is a conservative estimate. There were just hundreds of people gathered both inside the station and outside the station when the artillery shells started coming in, and they had no chance whatsoever. They were just the shrapnel from the shells coming in to the area in front of the station. I've passed it several times over the course of the last 24 hours. It was just awful. No chance of escape at all. They were just shredded by shrapnel in many cases, and died on the spot. You know, the first aid workers tried to do what they could, but it was a bloodbath.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. Robert Parsons in Kramatorsk. Let's come back to Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Peter. Mariupol, what's happened in Kyiv?
There with Peter Zalmayev and France 24's Mark Owen there in Kyiv. It's live television. We're going to try now to reconnect with Mark and his guest.
We've lost the link.
Oh.
Welcome back, Francois Picard there, just keeping us in the picture now. We're back live in Kyiv with Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Peter, we were talking about Kramatorsk, our chief runner, Robert Parsons, describing what happened at the station. I asked you whether in the other occupied places of Ukraine, whether, and this is the frustrating thing, I suppose, from everybody's perspective, things have happened. Will people ever be made to face justice for those things they've done?
First of all, all these atrocities have a special meaning to me. Kramatorsk, you know, I grew up in Donetsk, and my grandma lived in Slavyansk. All these towns are on the way from Donetsk to Slavyansk. I used to pass by them. Some of my relatives live there. So all of this is very painful. When you talk about Mariupol, we still don't know the full scale of the atrocities there. We have reports that Russians were using portable crematoria to burn victims. They're now
hiding the evidence, basically.
Exactly. They're now reportedly burning their own fighters, including from the Wagner group. But we heard that early in the war they were trying to hide the evidence. We don't know the scale of what happened, but by all accounts, it's pretty staggering. Nothing like what was happening in 2014 and 15. I referred earlier to the precedent of MH17. I was struck when Putin went on air after that tragedy. I was very naively hoping that there would be some kind of coming to terms and let's stop this and this. No. I was disabused of any of my hopes. For as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, the only thing that keeps him in power is the system of lies as official policy. No reckoning with the past for as long as this guy.
Because in the past week he said, of course, that it was Ukraine and the West that caused the conflict.
Exactly.
That's what he said, which clearly is not true. It's not true at all. You mentioned MH17. A friend of mine was on that flight.
Oh, gosh.
It's an appalling thing to have happened, and one would have thought that would have changed the whole sort of sense of it.
Exactly. I had that feel, and to me, that it just encapsulates. That's a tragedy, and the majority of the dead were not even Ukrainians. But that encapsulates to me the entire tragedy of this war.
You also mentioned the Wagner mercenaries. Their role appears to have changed from, if you like, trained killers, trained fighters to cannon fodder. How does that happen? And does this represent some kind of breakdown between...
In the 21st century, you wonder, right? And we are seeing this breakdown and these guys coming to blows with the regular army, etc. And Ukrainian officials have said things to the effect that we kind of welcome that. It shows that there's disarray, and it really exposes Vladimir Putin for not just the ineptitude of this campaign, but the fact that he never even prepared his populace, despite the propaganda for this war. You know, the generals went in without knowing the scale of what was awaiting them. A lot of soldiers didn't even know they were in Ukraine when they were sent there. And I think that's all you need to know about, you know, this operation and the way it's been, you know, prosecuted. And this, I think, the deep inside, the shame of the soldiers themselves, of the generals, and maybe even Vladimir Putin, deep down the understanding that this is not a righteous war. This is not anything like World War II. This is fitting that we're meeting here in this World War II museum that's been converted into the museum of, you know, the heirs of the invading army. It's now the Russians who are playing the role of the invaders. You know, the irony is very thick, and you know, I think deep down Russians understand that this is not a righteous war. I mean, at least that's my hope. Maybe I'm naive once again. but I mean, you have to sort of cling to some sort of, humanity, even in your enemy. If we're ever to come to terms with each other, if we're ever to live in peace again, it can only come through reconciliation and coming to terms with the past.
Peter Zalmayev, speaking from the heart, thank you very much indeed for sharing the time with us. It's always a pleasure to see you. Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Peter's from the Donbass. Our next report is from the Donbass. Robert Parsons went there, met a group of fighters involved there near to Donetsk.
7 kilometers behind the front line in the Donbass, Ukrainian tank crews take their orders for the day ahead. The snow ensures that no Russian drones are around to target their positions. Hidden beneath the sparse tree cover, this tank forms part of a second defensive line, ready to leap forward into attack if the Russians break through Ukrainian positions. But the tank crew is frustrated by its limitations.
In its day, this was a very good tank and its technology was top secret. But now it's old and difficult to fight in. Look, it's as old as I am, and I'm no spring chicken.
Inside, conditions for the 3-man crew are cramped. Room here for the driver only. Their commander says everyone is focused on victory, but he's desperate to see the German Leopard tanks that have now been promised to Ukraine.
The main issue is those Western tanks. If we get all the tanks our commander-in-chief has asked for, we can completely change the intensity of our fighting. We can drive them out of our country. We really need those tanks.
With the Russian offensive expected here any time, the commander has to make the best of what he's got now. These old Soviet-era tanks have to be ready. They take the T-64 on a test run to put it through its paces. Battle ready once more, it resumes its position beneath the tree cover. They have to check that another tank is in working order. It was in combat less than a week ago and has destroyed 5 Russian tanks since the war began. But it's in need of constant repair. This is a T-64. It's the main battle tank in the Ukrainian army. A good, solid tank, but more than 50 years old in many cases, which helps explain why Ukrainian tank crews spend 70% of their time repairing them. Time to take a break from the cold. This crew are fortunate. They can take shelter in a house in a nearby village. Others have to dig their own shelters in the open fields. It's a roof over their heads, but for 7 men, the conditions are cramped and temporary.
Since the start of the war, we haven't been able to stay in one place for more than a few days. It's too dangerous for the soldiers and the machines. The longer we stay, the faster the Russians can find us.
Constantly ready to move, constantly under stress. Small comforts are all they have.
I hope we can force the Russians out by the end of spring. With the help of God and our partners, we'll expel them from our country. Then we will live in peace and return to our families.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, reads the slogan scrawled across the wall. More poignant are the pictures drawn by their children. They haven't seen their families for 4 months. When they're sent out into combat, these pictures on the back of the front door are a reminder that someone's waiting for them back home.
Let's bring in Robert Parsons once again for more on this story. Rob, the men you met, under-resourced, but nonetheless they have that resolve in their soul which might defy all odds.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Mark. You've really hit the nail on the head there. They're absolutely determined. I met several men in that unit, and the story we got from them was always the same, that they were determined, that they knew they could do the job, that it was very difficult with the equipment that they had, but if they got the equipment that they were demanding, those tanks that we were talking about in that package, in particular the Leopard tanks from Germany, then they were absolutely sure that they could push forward, get through Russian positions, and ultimately force them out of the country. And I'm sure they will be encouraged by the news coming from Poland today that the first Leopard tanks have come into Ukraine, and news too from Sweden that they're sending another 10, possibly a little bit less, but maybe 10 Leopard tanks in the very near future. So the beginnings of what they're demanding are already happening. They're looking for at least 100 Western tanks, and it looks possible now that by the end of this month they may just get them.
Robert Parsons, thank you, as always, very much indeed. Robert Parsons joining us from Kramatorsk. Peter Zalmayev is still with us. Peter, Rob was talking about the first Leopard tanks coming to Ukraine, something that, of course, many people have been asking for and many people will be applauding. Is this going to be enough? President Zelensky is saying today resources are needed to have battlefield advantage. Will the Allies deliver?
Well, first of all, I have to say that in times of war, there's a proliferation of armchair soldiers and generals. I don't profess to be a military expert, but I just came from the Munich Security Conference, and I was actually at a press conference with Zelensky an hour ago. And obviously, in times of war, there's never anything, nothing is ever enough. The thing is that Vladimir Putin is really angling for some kind of a freezing of the conflict. We hear signs, signals from the Russians that they may be willing to sit down and talk, but that's only with the purpose of freezing it at the current front line, you know, in order to rebuild their army, in order to have some breathing space and then attack Ukraine again. Vladimir Putin has not given up on his maximalist goal of invading Ukraine, controlling it, or short of that, just destroying it. This is exactly what he's doing. And so the argument is that Ukraine needs to get as many weapons and as fast as possible to be able to stage a successful counteroffensive, maybe break through this land corridor that leads from Russia to the Crimea, and reach some kind of a state from where it would be advantageous for Ukraine to sit down and talk. Right now, we're just simply not there. And so the argument is get Ukraine as much as possible. Stop worrying about Putin's red lines. If Ukraine needs F-16s, give them F-16s. Start training pilots. Give them ATACMS. You know, stop worrying about Putin's intentions.
Peter Zalmayev, thank you very much indeed.